Nobody on that train paid much attention to the man sitting alone near the window, until everything changed. He wore a faded brown jacket and plain sneakers, his back straight, eyes distant, like he was deep in thought. No phone, no book, just silence, the kind that made people uneasy without knowing why. A group of loud passengers dressed flashy and laughing too hard decided he looked like the perfect target for a few jokes. They mocked his clothes, called him broke, laughed at his stillness. But by the end of that ride, nobody was laughing. Not after they learned who he really was. It was a humid afternoon in Ouagadougou, the kind where the air sticks to your skin and the sun beats down with a certain kind of persistence, like it is testing your patience. The local train was pulling out of the station, its carriages rattling, like they had not seen proper maintenance in years. People were settling into their seats with bags on laps, food in hand, and the kind of chatter that comes when strangers are forced to sit shoulder to shoulder. In the middle of all that noise, there was one man who sat completely still. He had boarded without drawing any attention, no entourage, no luggage apart from a modest black backpack slung over one shoulder. He walked slowly, deliberately, and chose a window seat near the back. That part of the train was quieter, not empty but filled with people who seemed more focused on their own thoughts than idle conversation. He fit right in. He wore a dull brown jacket that had seen better days, with the collar slightly frayed. His pants were plain, and his shoes were scuffed at the toes. He looked like any other, quiet traveler, the kind who minds his own business and expects others to do the same, except there was something about the way he carried himself. Upright posture, steady breathing, eyes fixed on the landscape outside, that felt just a little too composed for someone supposedly blending in. Across from him sat an older woman, with a basket of plantains. She glanced at him a few times, curious but respectful. She said nothing. A couple of students a few rows ahead were glued to their phones, mumbling over memes and scrolling endlessly. The train rolled through the outskirts of the city, the buildings thinning out and giving way to dry open land. That was when a small group entered at the next station. 4 of them, young men, probably in their early 20s, dressed like they, were trying too hard to impress. Loud designer shirts, spotless sneakers, sunglasses indoors. One of them carried a Bluetooth speaker blasting some local rap song. The rest of the carriage turned to look, most with mild irritation, some with visible annoyance. The conductor said nothing. They strolled in like they owned the place and took seats a few rows ahead of the quiet man. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, nudged his friend and nodded toward the back. "Yo, look at that guy," he whispered, though not really whispering. "Looks like he just crawled out of a history book." The others laughed. "Must be a school teacher," another one joked. "Or maybe some bush farmer who got lost." "He is probably one of those preachers," said the third. "You know, the kind that tells you not to sin and then borrows money for blessings." The quiet man did not turn around. He did not blink. He kept looking out the window, watching the trees blur into each other. A middle-aged man nearby looked up, sensing the shift in energy. His eyes darted between the loud group and the solitary figure in the back. He said nothing, just pulled his cap lower and leaned against the window. The train carried on. For a while, things were calm again. The boys continued talking and laughing, but the tension had settled like dust in the air, subtle, but impossible to ignore. And still, the quiet man did not move, did not engage. He simply watched the world outside, hands resting on his knees, like someone who had long learned that silence can be more powerful than words. That was when something strange happened. A uniformed soldier boarded at the next stop, briefcase in hand. He walked down the aisle briskly, scanning the carriage. When his eyes met the quiet man's, his pace slowed. He stopped completely. His body stiffened, and then, to everyone's confusion, the soldier bowed his head slightly. It was not a dramatic gesture, just a quiet, respectful tilt, the kind you see when someone greets an elder or a respected leader. He nodded once, stood still for a beat, and then took a seat in a different carriage. Nobody said a word, except the boys up front. They had noticed. "What was that?" one of them whispered. Did you see that? That guy bowed. Maybe they know each other, one offered, unsure. But a few seeds of doubt had been planted. They glanced back again, this time not with mockery, but with a trace of confusion. The man still had not moved. At this point, a few more passengers were looking his way, not openly, but out of the corners of their eyes. There was a quiet hum in the carriage now, a shift in the mood. The loudest of the boys, the one with the Bluetooth speaker, seemed suddenly less interested in his music. He turned it off. Someone else recognized the man, a woman in the aisle seat. She leaned toward the window, peering carefully, and then gasped. It was not loud, but it was enough. She reached into her handbag and pulled out her phone, scrolling quickly through some photos, and then she froze. She looked up at the man, then back at her phone. Then she looked again. Her lips parted slightly. She did not speak, but her body language screamed it. Something was very, very off. The older woman with the plantains finally broke the silence. Her voice was soft but clear. "You should be ashamed," she said, eyes locked on the boys up front. They turned, startled. "What? You mock a man whose shoes you cannot fill. You insult someone you do not understand. That is how the young behave now?" One of them scoffed. You were just disrespectful," she cut in. "And one day you will learn that people like him, they do not need to speak to be heard." The train rattled on. The wind hissed through the gaps in the windows, and somewhere just past the horizon things were beginning to change. Nobody said it out loud, but the feeling was growing. The quiet man was not just some poor traveler. He was someone important, someone powerful. But for now, he remained silent. His eyes stayed fixed on the passing fields like he had all the time in the world. The train continued its journey, swaying rhythmically as it cut through the dry landscape. Inside, the energy had changed. Conversations had dimmed. The group of boys who had earlier filled the carriage with noise now sat awkwardly, stealing glances at the quiet man in the back. He had still not spoken, not even once. But now his silence was no longer taken as weakness. It had weight to it, like a wall that nobody dared to touch. The soldier's strange behavior had sparked something. That, and the woman with the phone who had turned pale after looking at the screen. She kept glancing back and forth between the man and her phone, her face painted with disbelief. She did not say his name, but her expression said everything. There was recognition there, not a casual, "Oh, I think I know him from somewhere," but a sharp, almost reverent realization. The boys noticed, especially the one with the slick hair and golden chain. He was beginning to look nervous, fidgeting with the zipper of his bag. "Okay, but seriously," he whispered to his friend beside him. "Who do you think he is?" "I do not know," the other muttered. "Maybe he is military. That guy with the briefcase gave him a salute or something." "Salute?" the third chimed in. "It was just a nod." "No, man," the fourth said. "That was respect." They were no longer joking. The bravado had drained out of their voices. Now it was all hushed tones and side eyes. That arrogant ease from earlier had vanished like smoke. A few rows away, a man in a wrinkled shirt, probably a schoolteacher by the looks of him, took out his phone and started scrolling too. He kept switching between apps, news, Twitter, photos, his brow furrowing as he occasionally looked toward the quiet man. He leaned to the woman next to him. Could that really be him? Ibrahim Traoré?" she whispered, eyes wide. "No. Why would he be on a train?" "Exactly. Why would someone like him be traveling like this?" he replied, though even he sounded unsure. This name hung in the air like thunder before a storm. President Ibrahim Traoré, the youngest leader in Africa. A man whose rise to power had been dramatic, some would even say revolutionary. Stories about him were everywhere, how he came from humble beginnings, how he walked among the people even after becoming president, how he disliked the pomp and flash of traditional power. But surely, it could not be him. Could it? Someone finally had the nerve to try and find out. A teenage girl sitting a few rows closer to the man got up under the pretense of going to the restroom. But as she passed by his seat, she slowed, just slightly, just long enough to steal a better look. He did, not even flinch, but something about the lines of his face, the way he sat, it struck her. He had the same quiet intensity she had seen in news photos, that calm presence. She made it all the way to the end of the carriage and disappeared behind the restroom door. But when she came back a few minutes later, she was different, paler, wide-eyed. She whispered something to her mother and then sat down without a word, clutching her phone like it was suddenly made of glass. One of the boys finally cracked. The one with the Bluetooth speaker leaned forward and turned to the man in the wrinkled shirt. "Excuse me," he said, voice shaky but trying to stay casual. "That man in the back, you think he is really, the president?" The man blinked. "You mocked him like he was nothing. Now you want to know who he is?" "I did not mock him," he said quickly. "It was my friends." Convenient. They both looked toward the quiet man, who had finally moved. Just slightly. He had adjusted his collar and reached into his jacket pocket. For a second, everyone tensed, as if expecting something dramatic. But all he pulled out was a small notebook and a pen. He opened it slowly and began to write. There was something beautiful and terrifying about the simplicity of it. A woman in the front of the carriage cleared her throat. "Maybe we should leave him alone." "Yes." Someone else agreed. "This is not a zoo." But it was too late. Word had spread. It was no longer just about one man on a train. It had become something else, an invisible current running through the carriage, electric and unspoken. Even those who had not heard the name yet could feel it. That strange heaviness, the way people shifted in their seats and avoided meeting his eyes, the way they spoke in whispers now. It was like they were all realizing they had been part of something they did not fully understand. The boys were whispering, again. What if it really is him? Do you think he is here to test the public? Why would he travel without security? Because that is how real leaders move, the boy with the chain muttered. The others looked at him, surprised. He looked embarrassed by the admiration in his voice. The train stopped again. A few people got off, but more stayed on, either too curious or too wary to move. Nobody dared approach the man, not after the soldier's bow, not after the way the woman had gasped looking at her phone. Still, the man never looked back. Never said a word, until a little boy ran down the aisle chasing a toy car. The child accidentally bumped into the quiet man's seat, dropped the toy and looked up nervously, and for the first time in over an hour, the quiet man smiled. A small, gentle smile. He picked up the toy, handed it to the boy, and said something so softly that only the boy could hear. The boy stared at him in awe. He nodded, then ran back to his mother, who was already halfway out of her seat, ready to apologize. But the boy clutched her arm and whispered excitedly, "Mama, that man, he is a king." Nobody laughed. Because somewhere deep down, even the most skeptical passenger had started to believe it, not because of a name, not because of any title, but because of how silence, composure, and quiet strength can command more respect than noise ever will. The train was still hours away from its final stop, but already this journey had become unforgettable, and they had not even seen the climax yet. By the time the train crossed into the outer edges of Bobo Dioulasso, the mood in the carriage had turned solemn. The dusty sunlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows on the worn-out seats. And there, in the last row, the quiet man remained seated, unshaken, unreadable, and completely still. The group of boys who had mocked him earlier were now as quiet as statues. One of them, the one who had laughed the loudest, was slouched in his seat, arms crossed, lips pressed shut. The Bluetooth speaker had been turned off long ago, and the music that once bounced off the walls had faded into memory. The passengers were no longer talking. Not really. They whispered occasionally, but most just watched. Not directly, of course. That would be rude, but they watched through stolen glances, tilted mirrors on their phones, or quiet reflection. The silence was not empty. It was expectant. Something was about to happen. Everyone felt it. And then it did. The train began to slow as it neared a small station on the outskirts of the city. Not the main stop, just a minor one, usually ignored. But this time, something was different. As they neared the platform, people inside the carriage noticed something unusual outside. Soldiers. Not just a few, but at least a dozen. Fully uniformed, standing perfectly still in formation. Their presence was sharp and immediate, like the strike of a match in the dark. One of the passengers stood up to get a better look. "That is the military," he whispered. "Waiting for someone," another added. "They must be here for him," the teacher said, pointing subtly to the back of the carriage. And then, before anyone could argue or second-guess, the train stopped. The door opened with a mechanical hiss, and in stepped a tall man in full military dress. His boots were polished to a mirror shine. His expression was stone-cold serious. Eyes sharp, he took 2 steps forward into the carriage, stood tall, scanned the room slowly, and then locked eyes with the man at the back. Then he did something that confirmed every rumor, every whisper, every moment of doubt. He dropped to one knee and saluted. Not the casual nod from earlier. Not a respectful glance. But a full, formal, soldier's salute, complete with a bowed head and a clenched fist against his chest. The carriage went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop. The officer spoke in a voice strong enough for the entire carriage to hear. "Mr. President, your team is waiting outside." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The quiet man slowly stood up. His movement was calm, deliberate. He picked up a simple bag. No entourage, no security detail inside the train, no bodyguards flanking him. Just a plain bag with a few papers, a pen, and his notebook. He stepped into the aisle. The same passengers who had ignored him when he first boarded now shrank back to give him space. They stared wide-eyed at the man they had thought was just another passenger. The soldier standing at the door stepped aside and saluted again as the quiet man walked past him. But before he exited, Ibrahim Traoré stopped. He turned his head slightly, scanning the carriage, not with disdain or pride, but with something deeper. Understanding, maybe even forgiveness. His eyes landed briefly on the group of boys who had mocked him. They shrank, in their seats. But he did not scold them. Instead, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not just a gesture, it was a message. I saw everything, and I chose silence. Then he stepped out of the carriage. Outside, more soldiers were waiting. Black SUV with diplomatic plates stood nearby. But there were no flashing lights, no spectacle. Just discipline, just quiet reverence. Inside the train, passengers leaned toward the windows, craning their necks to catch a glimpse. The soldier who had bowed entered the carriage one last time, turned to face the passengers and gave a single short sentence. "Next time you meet a stranger, show respect. You never know whose presence you are sharing." And then he left. Nobody spoke for a long time. The train started moving again. The only sound was the low hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of someone shifting in their seat. The group of boys sat in stunned silence. No jokes, no smirks. The man with the wrinkled shirt looked out the window as the station disappeared behind them. "I will never forget this day," he murmured. The woman next to him nodded slowly. Neither will anyone else. As the train sped on, the mood inside had transformed completely. It was not just about witnessing a moment of national significance. It was about being reminded, viscerally, of something they had forgotten. Power does not always speak loudly. Sometimes it just listens, and true authority does not need to be announced. It is felt. What they had seen was more than a man leaving a train. It was the embodiment of dignity, humility, and strength, without ever raising his voice. They had laughed at the quiet man sitting alone, But they would carry the weight of that laughter for a long, long time, because that quiet man was Ibrahim Traoré, the president, and none of them had seen it coming. The days following the train ride passed by in a blur for many of the passengers. What had been a simple, mundane journey now lived on in their minds, almost like a dream, or a lesson. The truth of the moment only seemed to sink in deeper, the more they reflected. For the group of boys, the lesson was the hardest. They had always prided themselves on their confidence. They had lived their lives in a constant state of asserting dominance, knowing how to hold their own in any situation. Mocking people, poking fun, cracking jokes, this had been their norm. But that day they learned the uncomfortable truth. There are some people in the world who do not need to prove anything. The boy with the Bluetooth speaker had not been the same since. The arrogance that had fueled him in the past seemed absent. He tried to laugh it off when his friends teased him about his earlier attitude, but it was clear. He had been humbled, deeply humbled. It was the same with the boy who had worn the golden chain, the one who had been the loudest of all. At school, he was known for his swagger, his cocky smile, his bravado. But now, he walked with his head down more often than not, as if weighed down by something invisible. Whenever he spoke, his voice lacked the usual confidence. "Do you remember how we laughed?" he said to one of his friends, months after the incident. "I keep thinking about it, and it's embarrassing. We were so sure he was nothing. So sure. I thought he was just some dude traveling for business," his friend admitted, looking down at his shoes. "But now, I guess I was wrong." They never spoke about it again. Not aloud, anyway. But the reality of what had happened was always there, hanging over their interactions. They could no longer talk about themselves as if they were kings of the world. The quiet man had showed them something that could not be unlearned. For the passengers who had been more observant, those who had recognized the man, the experience was less about mockery and more about awe. It was almost as if they had witnessed something sacred, something they were never meant to see. The knowledge that Ibrahim Traoré had traveled among them, unnoticed, had shaken them in ways they did not understand. The woman who had gasped in recognition, the one who had quietly snapped a photo of him, never showed anyone the image. She kept it to herself. But every time her phone buzzed and she saw the face of the man who had once been a mere name on a news report, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. It wasn't just about meeting a world leader. It was about the way he had carried himself, how he had shown that true strength does not need to announce itself to the world. The teacher who had spent the journey whispering about the man's identity told no one. But when he sat with his colleagues at a local cafe, he recounted the story to his closest friend. "I have taught students about humility, about leadership," he said softly. But seeing him, living it, was different. It was something else. A lesson I will never forget. Even the little boy who had bumped into Ibrahim Traoré had learned something that day. He told his mother later as they sat down for dinner, "That man, he was a king, Mama, and he didn't even need a crown." The mother smiled gently, running a hand through his hair. "Yes, sweetheart, sometimes the greatest leaders wear no crowns." There was no denying the truth that had been set before them. Ibrahim Traoré was more than a president. He was a symbol, a reminder that the greatest power comes not from force or spectacle, but from inner strength, humility, and the ability to remain unshaken, even in the face of mockery. Some months later, the same train route was taken by another group of travelers. They had no idea that just a short time before, a world leader had sat among them unnoticed. But the energy in the carriage was different this time. It was lighter, quieter. The way people looked at each other, how they conducted themselves in the space, it had all changed, even if they could not pinpoint why. The echo of that encounter lingered, not just in the passengers' memories, but in the way they moved through the world. They became more aware of the quiet man sitting in the corner. They started to understand that there were lessons all around them, in every interaction, in every glance, and in every silence. And that is what made the train ride so extraordinary. Not the fact that they had encountered Ibrahim Traoré, but The quiet, powerful way he had shown them a truth they had not known they needed to learn. Some people come into our lives not to teach us words, but to show us the way. Months passed, and as time often does, it blurred the edges of the event. The immediate shock and awe of the train ride began to fade for some. Life moved on. Yet for the passengers who had witnessed it, that day remained in their hearts, like a watermark that could not be erased. In the quiet moments, when their minds wandered, they would remember. Ibrahim Traoré, the quiet man sitting alone on the train. The boys who had mocked him never fully understood the depths of what had happened. They could never fully grasp the power of that silent, unspoken moment. It wasn't about the fact that he was the president. No, it was something far deeper. It was about how he had carried himself, how he had allowed the world to look past him, to underestimate him, only to prove that the loudest presence does not always come from the person who speaks the most. Sometimes it comes from the one who listens. They learned that the hard way. One of the boys, the one who had been the loudest, tried to convince his friends that the experience had not affected him. "I am not bothered by it," he said, but there was a tremor in his voice. The confidence in his words didn't match the uncertainty in his eyes. He kept trying to make jokes, but the humor never quite landed the way it used to. It wasn't that they didn't still find him funny. It was that they now noticed something different, a vulnerability where once there had been arrogance. The story of the train ride, how they had laughed at the quiet man, mocked him, ignored him, had become a tale in their school. But it wasn't the kind of story people would laugh at. It wasn't the kind of story that gave them any sense of superiority. It made them uncomfortable. Years later, the boys, now young men, would still occasionally talk about that day. It was one of those moments that stayed with them forever, a moment they would never forget. Every time they saw someone sitting quietly in public, whether on a bus, in a cafe, or on a bench in a park, they would feel the stirrings of that lesson they had learned in a single, powerful moment. Do not assume. Do not laugh at the quiet. Do not mock the ones who appear less. The woman who had taken the photo of Ibrahim Traoré told a friend about the encounter. She didn't speak to many people about it, but when the conversation naturally turned to world leaders or moments of history, she couldn't help but share the experience. "I didn't recognize him at first," she admitted. "He was just another man sitting alone, but the way he held himself, there was something there, something about him that made you want to respect him without even knowing who he was." Her friend nodded thoughtfully. "That's true power, isn't it? The kind that doesn't demand attention." The teacher, who had been one of the first to recognize Ibrahim Traoré, felt the need to reflect on what he had learned, too. He had taught history for years, but there was something about that encounter that had put everything into perspective. He was reminded of the lessons he had passed on to his students, lessons about leaders, about integrity, about the way true strength doesn't need validation. After all, what better way to teach about leadership than to witness it in its most subtle, unassuming form? He often told his students about that train ride, about how power had walked among them, unnoticed, by many yet undeniably present. He never named the man, but the lesson was clear. Leadership is not always about the loudest voice or the most public display. Sometimes it's about sitting in silence, about knowing your worth without needing anyone else to see it. For the woman sitting by the window, the encounter had left a different impression. The fact that Ibrahim Traoré had not only been dignified in the face of mockery, but also had the foresight to simply walk away, no confrontation, no words wasted, had stayed with her long after the train ride. She thought about it every time. She had to make a difficult decision. Every time someone tried to pull her into drama or conflict, she would think of him, how he had chosen silence over response, peace over chaos. "I think that's the real lesson," she told her husband one evening. "It's about knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet." He didn't let them provoke him. He didn't need to prove anything. Her husband agreed, though his mind lingered on another aspect of the encounter. "I'm still amazed at how few people recognized him. That kind of humility. It's rare." Over time, The story of Ibrahim Traoré's quiet presence began to seep into the broader public narrative. People spoke of the humility that so often accompanies true leadership. They spoke of how he had taught an entire carriage full of strangers, a lesson not through speeches or formal addresses, but through a simple act of silence, of dignity, and of choice. The day he sat on that train wasn't just another day in the life of a president. It was a reminder that the most powerful people in the world are often the ones who make the least noise. And in the quiet of that train, Ibrahim Traoré had shown them all something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. True strength does not need to shout. It simply is. As for the quiet man, he continued his journey. But the world would never see him in quite the same way again. Because, in the briefest of moments, the world had seen the truth. Power, true power, does not require validation. It simply exists.